We're like a 40-some person consultancy based out of Chicago, although that's kind of an arbitrary distinction at the moment because we're all remote. But we I've been there doing mostly mobile work for about 6 years now. And over the last few years, I switched from doing native mobile code in mostly Swift and sometimes Objective-C and sometimes Java if we were doing Android, to using React Native almost exclusively. We now use that pretty much. That's our stack for just about every app that we create, even ones that aren't cross-platform, because React Native does let you do iOS and Android at the same time. But the cool thing about it is it's just got a really great set of tools that it shares with a lot of the React web world. So that's actually part of why I started doing more front-end web work, because now I can cross over and just do React on the web, and it's basically the same thing. There are differences, but the overall experience of building an app is really, really similar. And so if you learn, you can also cross over the other direction, and a lot of people at our shop have done that, where you can go from React Web to React Native, and it's actually a pretty low friction way to introduce yourself to mobile development, which is really cool. So I've been giving this particular workshop now for several years, and it kind of went from explaining why, when React was still kind of the new kid on the block and was a little bit of a novelty, I was trying to explain what the appeal of it was. In addition to, introducing you to it, I want to help people understand why it's a big deal and why it got as popular as it is and what kind of problems it solves. And in that time, React has gone from that new kid on the block to being really well established. It's only gotten more popular, and I think more firmly just set as like a tool that a lot of front-end people use. It's not perfect for every single thing you might want to do in the front end, but it really is pretty great. Just in the way that it kind of abstracts and takes away a lot of the difficult work that you just don't want to do and lets you just focus on making a good responsive UI. So we're going to go into that a little bit. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So this is an interactive workshop, so I'm hoping you can all follow along. I think everybody's set up to create their apps and everything, right? They've got NPM installed and everything.
Yeah, they should have everything installed. If not, they can reach out to us and we'll help.
Okay. And by the way, this is like, we have like 3 hours set aside. This is usually like a 2-hour workshop, so there's a lot of time to ask questions. So feel free to interrupt me at any point. If you're curious about something, I'm happy to over-explain everything, because I think React's really cool. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so this is React. What's the big deal? I just think it's important to, like I said, to understand what exactly does React do for you that, just regular JavaScript and HTML didn't. Because some of you, probably most of you, were not doing web design or a lot of JavaScript work, 10, 15 years ago when these kind of things didn't exist. But it's really amazing just how much is built up over that time and how much easier it is for you to just get up and running and create something really cool pretty quickly. So what is React? What exactly is it? It's a JavaScript library for creating views. That's pretty much it. It's really not more complicated than that. There's tons of tools that plug into it. It's got this big ecosystem. There's a lot you can do with it, but ultimately all it really is just for making views. It doesn't handle, it doesn't handle databases. It doesn't handle the kind of back-end stuff that sounds like you're working in Django. So it sounds like you dipped your toes into that kind of thing. The underlying structure of an app, React doesn't do that for you. It's designed to just be the view layer. And what makes it special, you'll notice there's an asterisk after special, because special doesn't mean unique, especially not anymore, because as React got more popular, a lot of other libraries started taking ideas from it. So if you ever use Angular, Vue, or some other JavaScript frameworks that are kind of similar, you're actually going to find them to have a lot of these qualities as well. But this does still make it special, because this is the building blocks of React as I see it. First off, there's components, then there's JSX. The diffing algorithm, that might sound complicated, but don't worry. The whole point of it is you don't need to even know it's there. And then the ecosystem, meaning like the whole, developer community and all of the tools that exist out there for it. Components are a really core concept of React. And they basically they let you break up your UI into these small discrete pieces that are only doing one thing at a time. Maybe they can be as complicated as you want. As you're going to see as we go through this, React is not very opinionated, and it really lets you build an app however you want. But the way React is set up, it encourages you and makes it easy to structure things in this particular way, where you really break up your app into different pieces. And you'll see as we go through like what that means, why that's effective. JSX, that's the particular sort of markup, it's not really a language, but the markup approach that React takes to mix JavaScript and HTML together in a clear way. I call it a Frankenstein's monster, but a good monster. It's really helps give you the best of both worlds and makes it easy to make readable code that is still powerful and dynamic, and you can easily add interactive elements to it. It's actually optional. JSX is not required to write React, and it's a lot nicer than the alternative though. This code here you see on the left side in that column, I've got some JSX, which probably looks a lot like HTML. There's only a couple little tricky things about it. On the right side is the JavaScript that is actually creating. So what React does is it takes JSX and it just kind of converts it under the hood into essentially what that JavaScript is over there. I also made this screenshot a while ago. I have no idea if this is even still what React does with the actual JavaScript that gets output, because I never ever look at that. It's not really something you're gonna have to worry about as a React developer. You just look on the left side where you have this nice, easily readable bit of JSX, and that's all you're ever gonna have to handle. So the diffing algorithm I mentioned is, what that means is underneath the hood, again, React is watching for changes in the state of every component. And when that state changes, so the data changes, the UI just updates. It refreshes and it shows new things, and there's no thinking required on your part at all. This is hugely powerful. It's pretty common, like I said, other JavaScript frameworks now do this too. It's just the standard across the board, but it used to be that when you were using jQuery, for example, which was also a set of tools in JavaScript to make web development easier, you still had to worry about, okay, my user just changed something, right? They entered in a new, they entered in a new username and they updated it, and I got back the new username from, the back end. Now I need to show that username on the screen. So you were constantly worrying about every time that data updated, making that change manually to your UI. And that kind of stuff added up a lot over the course of a complicated app. It became a huge concern of yours as a developer, and it was far and away the most likely place you were going to run into problems. And oftentimes it was the hardest place to debug those problems, because if you had a whole complicated page, everything's updating at once, things are asynchronous, some of your API calls are taking longer than others, nothing is guaranteed to happen in a particular order, you could easily run into weird conditions where your UI would be in a state you didn't like it being. And the great thing about React is that almost never happens. I don't want to say it never happens, but it significantly cuts down on the amount of just boilerplate work you have to do to update your UI. And that's one of the things that's probably the coolest about it. And beyond that, it's really up to you what React is and how you use it in your own apps. I think I've called it a framework a couple of times throughout this. There's not really a great word for it. It's not really a framework because it doesn't really have a set structure. It's more like a set of tools, and you use the tools however you want to use them. Once again, it's just the view layer, so it doesn't really manage. It does manage a certain amount of state, but it's not designed to, like I said, it's not designed to run a database. It's not designed to have this whole complicated set of logic going on behind the scenes. It's designed to be the view layer in front of whatever you have underneath it that's handling that. So the structure for the app comes from other tools. Some of those are within React. Redux is a big one. Redux is a really great tool for building a state for your app that can update in a really predictable and understandable way. You'll probably hear about that a lot if you start getting into React. It's too complicated to go into in this intro class, but sometime I'd like to do a Redux workshop, because it's really very cool. And I think learning Redux is almost as important as learning React in the long run. Then there are, of course, back-end frameworks, things like Rails, Node, Django, all sorts of options there for, managing, the actual complexity of data storage and, the logic of your app. And React can plug into pretty much any of those. So you also have the option of just building your own structure. You could use React right out of the box, and you can, since it's just JavaScript, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Context and hooks are a couple of ways that you can do that. We were just talking about hooks a little bit earlier, and we are going to get into those. Those are ways that you can manage state, and also, well, that's what hooks are for, managing state. Context is for passing state or properties down through a complicated set of nested components. We're not going to get into that, but there are tools that are built into React that can let you do complicated stuff if you want. So that's pretty much the whole intro right now. I think it'd be great to just dive in, and let's just start playing around with React. So I don't know if you've all created an app yet, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it right now. It's very easy nowadays, thanks to NPX. I'm just going to type in. Can everyone see my text? Do I need to make it larger?
Make it a little bit bigger, please.
Better?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to run npx create React app. I don't know if you've all used npx yet. npx essentially, I don't fully understand how it works because it's still kind of new. But traditionally, npm is the package manager for Node, and it, allows you to download all the latest versions of these various pieces of software, including create React app, which is, it is a package that creates an app for you. NPX lets you run the latest version just kind of right out of the gate. You don't need to actually download it and store it globally. You don't need to manage any versions. It'll just take it and run it, essentially. You're essentially just running remote software, which feels a little weird, but it's very convenient. So it's what I'm doing right now. So I'm just going to run npx create React app, and then I just give it a name. I'm just going to call it code Platoon. You can call it whatever you want. You do have some limitations. I don't think it'll let you use capital letters in it. But once you do this, create React app is just going to create a nice, simple, basic React app. And I say basic and simple, even though a single React app is, I think, something like 60,000 files are actually going to get installed in the process of this. So it's all relative. Most of that complexity is totally hidden from you, so you don't need to worry about it. But it is worth remembering that if you're doing something very simple, React is not always the best tool, purely because it does assume you're going to build something a little bit complicated. All that structure is there with the assumption that you're going to need it. So if you're just doing like a little bit of interactivity to a single web page, you can still just use JavaScript if you want. Great. So that's all installed. That's created. If you look here at the very bottom, there's a great little bit of just some intro commands that you can run. You will notice that these commands all start with yarn. I don't know if you've talked at all about yarn versus npm. Okay.
Nope.
So npm is the package manager. Yarn is another package manager that kind of sits on top of it. It's doing all the npm stuff, but essentially it's a tool that added a bunch of features that npm didn't originally have. And npm has actually since added these back, so you can kind of use them interchangeably. I just typically use whatever React says to use, either here or on the React website. And they actually are quite fickle. They've changed several times. So it shouldn't really worry you, but for your purposes right now, yarn and npm are basically the same thing. You do need to have yarn installed though, in order to use it. So if you get an error about that, then you probably just need to install it. I'm pretty sure you can just do this, npm install global yarn, and then you'll have it available to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the folder I just created. And
just to be clear, we're downloading npx React app, create React app. That's a single app. So every time we want to create an app in React, we have to do this process. Is that right?
You don't have to. I mean, you can also manually copy over files if you want. This is just the easiest way to get everything that's like the most up to date.
Okay.
And since you're running NPX, you're not like you are downloading and then running Create React App, but you're just doing it on the fly. You don't need to manage it after that. It's not like placing Create React App somewhere. It might be buried in some temporary folder somewhere. I don't know, but it's not something you need to worry about.
Okay.
You're essentially running a remote command that's going to grab the latest kind of boilerplate React app and just like dump it into the folder.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to open this up in VS Code, which is what I use. I don't know. You're welcome to use any text editor you want here. But this one works pretty well for us. We use it. It's got a lot of really great extensions and integrations that make it easier to do React stuff in addition to other languages. So I'm inside my folder, and this is what Create React App created for me. You're going to see this yarn.lock file here. This is what Yarn originally did that NPM didn't, is it had the concept of a lock file. You might have seen this in Django as well. But basically it keeps track of exactly which versions of all these many packages you just installed, because like I said, there's like 60,000 files in here. So there's all these different dependencies which have their own sets of dependencies, and it kind of is this massive chain that goes very deep, and Yarn and NPM are just doing their best to help you manage that. Usually it's fairly simple and mindless and you don't have to deal with the complexity, but every now and then you will run into some issues with versions that don't quite match up and things like that. So that's just something to keep an eye on. We're not going to get into it in this tutorial. But the more important thing probably is the package.json file that got created here. This is sort of your central config file for your whole app. This is a Node thing, not React specific. So you'll see it in Node projects as well. But basically, it's where it stores. Most importantly, it stores your dependencies, all the things that React needs to run, and all the additional libraries you may install over time as you want more functionality. So in this case, there's not that much. This is sort of misleading because, like I said, there's many thousands of files that go into all of these things. But for your purposes, you just need to know, I have this version of React, I have this version of React DOM, I have these testing libraries, that sort of stuff. We're not going to be messing with this file at all right now, but there's actually a lot of stuff you can do with it. All those things that the console told me I could do, yarn start, yarn build, yarn test, yarn eject, those are just scripts inside this package file, and you can create your own scripts in here too if you want. But more importantly, let's go into the source folder that it created. So this is where our actual app is. Oh, and let me see if it actually, okay. So probably your browser will have opened automatically. Oh wait, no, you haven't started yet. Before I get any farther, let's go into the terminal. Let's run yarn start. Okay, and that should open up your browser, and you should see this or something very close to it, a little spinning React logo, and some basic instructions. So this is your basic bare bones app running right now. Yarn starts up an NPM server. So React is running on a server locally, and then your browser is pointing to that local server as though we're like a remote web page. This is the same way Django works and everything. But it's cool because you're going to see while that server is running, as we edit our code and save the files, it's going to be watching all the changes we make and updating totally live, so you don't even have to refresh the page. So if we jump into app.js, actually, no, before I get there, index.js right here. So this is actually this is sort of the entry point for your app. This is the main file. You generally won't be messing with this though. In this case, all it's actually doing is rendering the app. So app is a component. We got into this a little bit, and we'll start making our own components. This will make a little more sense soon, but everything that's inside the angle brackets here, that looks like an HTML component, but critically has a capital letter at the front. That's actually very important. These are all going to be React components. So our entire app is actually a component, and everything that sits inside it is another component. It's all nested components. So instead of messing around with index.js, which is really just making sure that our app gets rendered properly on screen, we're going to open up app.js, and this is the actual code that controls what we're seeing on screen at the moment. So you'll notice that edit app.js and save to reload. That's the same thing that the browser is telling us right here. So if you follow those instructions, change this to whatever you want. I just saved this. You'll notice it also reformatted because of some extensions I have. You may or may not have those. And then I didn't even have to refresh the page. This just worked. That might not seem like a big deal, but if you are a professional software developer and you do this every day, that saves you so much time in the long run. It really adds up, you know, day after day and year after year. It's very cool. So that's another thing you don't have to think about. And that's different from the diffing algorithm that I mentioned earlier. That changes the display based on the data in your app, but this is something using a tool called Watchman that changes the app that's running based on the files that you've saved. But the whole process from, you know, development to the actual running of the app is as streamlined as it possibly can be, so that everything is just reloading all the time and you're always seeing whatever is most recent, which is really powerful. Is everyone with me so far? Any issues getting this running? Great. So this is what we just did. If you play around with the text, mess around with the add your own text, you could add your own images or do whatever. You should just see everything reloading on screen, just like magic. You can also edit the style. So as we're looking over this, should, if you've ever used HTML, this should all look pretty familiar to you. There's just a few kind of bits of weirdness here. This right here is everything that's actually getting rendered on screen. This up here, function app, this is our app component, which is actually just a function. It's a simple JavaScript function that returns JSX. And React knows to look for these. It's happening pretty invisibly under the hood. So anytime you have a function that returns JSX, it just knows how to display that on screen as long as you're using all the right syntax. But everything that happens in here is actually JavaScript and is completely dynamic. You can put whatever kind of logic you want in there. So you'll notice that there's a div tag here, there's a header tag here, image tag, paragraph. Here's a link. All this stuff is just standard HTML. The only thing that's a little different is you're going to notice these curly braces here, where the logo is coming in, for example. And that's anything that's inside curly braces basically is JavaScript. And you can place that anywhere you want inside your HTML here. And that's what makes JSX basically, is that you can just kind of drop JavaScript right in the middle of it, which makes it really easy to do things like if you want to change the display based on a certain condition, whether the user's logged in or they are logged out or something. If you're grabbing information dynamically, like you want to say, hello, your user's name or something like that, it's very easy to put that in and actually be able to visually see what's going on without having to write a lot of logic, which is very cool. So most of the stuff that you need to worry about as far as display is actually just HTML. And CSS as well. So if you open up app.css, you can see we're importing that here. This is just normal CSS. This is not React specific or special in any way. So you can edit this and change this any way you would change CSS in a normal web page. So let's say we don't like this background color. We want to make it red. And that's hideous, but it worked. And as you see, that also instantaneously reloaded the page. Without me having to refresh anything in the browser itself. I'm going to change that back because that is really an eyesore. So, but anything you change here will instantly update. I'm going to make the min height a little smaller. Just making that 120 pixels. You can do this if you want to. The main reason I'm doing this is because we're going to be playing around a bit with the header and adding stuff to the body of the page. And the header is so gigantic that you can't see the body. So I want to make sure that I'm able to see it. So I just made it a little smaller. The only thing I mentioned that the CSS is the same as in a normal web page, but the only thing that's different in React is you need to use class name instead of class. So if you go into here, you can see that thanks to this dot notation here in the CSS, this is a class, a CSS class of app, a CSS class of app logo. Normally in HTML, you would apply that this way. The problem is in React, because we are in JavaScript land, class is actually a reserved word. It's used to create an actual class the same way you would in Python or something like that. We're going to look at how to do that a little later, actually, so you'll see an example. So the way they've gotten around that is when you want to put a class of CSS in something, you just have to use class name instead. Otherwise, it functions exactly the same way as it normally would. So I mentioned how we can just drop JavaScript right into our JSX. So let's go ahead and do that right now. We're going to replace the text here with a variable, just to show you how that works. So inside the function, above the return block here, this is all just JavaScript. I can put whatever I want in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a constant, and I'm going to call it, text. Oops. And we'll say, and from a variable. And instead of putting hello code Platoon here, just in plain text, I'm going to get rid of this, open up some curly braces, and I'm going to put in text right there. And as soon as I go back to my screen, boom, it's already updated. This is the kind of thing you're going to actually be doing quite a bit, because your views are going to probably be taking in data from various remote sources or possibly from the user's input. And this allows you to just put it right in the middle of your markup in a way that's easy to understand and doesn't require very much typing. So anytime text changes now, this is going to update automatically thanks to that the diffing algorithm that I mentioned. So does that make sense to everybody so far? Great. So let's keep moving. Let's try moving the header into a separate component. This is where we're going to start seeing how components actually work. So right now we have this body. Actually, we really don't have a body at all. We just have a header. So I'm going to move that text I just created down below the header here. And then I'm going to open this up again. Okay, so now our text is in the body of the page. This is the header. So right now we have a single component called app. And app is showing everything. But we can break this up into as many small components as we want. And as the app gets more complex, we're probably going to want to, because some of these things are going to have a lot of their own logic in them and be hard to manage if it's just this gigantic block of JSX. This isn't something that React cares about. React doesn't care how gigantic your components are. It will just display everything. This is more for you as a developer to be able to better understand what you're building and better manage the different pieces and how they work together. So, but like I said, you have a lot of freedom here. You are not required to do anything in a particular React-y way. It just kind of stays out of your way. So let's create a new component. We're going to call this header. Actually, let's call it my header. The reason I'm doing that is because header here is already an HTML component. There's nothing stopping me from doing a capital H header here and using that, but just for clarity, I want to make sure that we understand that we're using our component and not the HTML one. So I'm going to call it my header instead. So let's go ahead and grab all of this. And I'm going to return it here. And now, okay, I've got this separate React component up at the top, and then my app down here. Now, if I go back to the screen now, the header's gone, right? I removed that JSX. It's still here, but it's not showing up on screen, because what's going on here is the only thing being exported from the this file is app, the app component. So even though this exists here and it's perfectly valid, it's not going to show up on screen unless it actually gets presented. It makes its way up to the top level component, essentially. I need to actually display it somewhere. So what I'm going to do here is, right where this was in the code before, above my text, I'm going to open up some angle braces, and I'm going to put, oops, I'm going to put my header there, just like that. And now, when I open up the browser, it's back. So essentially, the component gives me back this JSX, and then that component becomes just this kind of little boxed in bit of markup. And then that can be placed in another component just like that. So essentially this just refers to this, and all of this logic here, it just gets wrapped up in there. And that's how you nest components, and you can just keep nesting them down as much as you want. And it's a really great way to understand at the top level, here's how my page is laid out. Here's all the different components that are on it, but all those components might have all this complexity in them, but you don't really want to worry about that at the top level. You just want to know where everything is, what's on screen, where they are in relation to each other. And then within those components, you can start adding complexity like this. And this is a really, really powerful feature of React right here. Is that making sense to everybody so far?
Yeah, is that the same syntax that's on index.js for app itself?
Yep, exactly. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you export more than one thing? I mean, you
can.
What I thought you were going to do first is just put a comma and put my header after the word app. And obviously what you did was a lot better, but.
Well, if I'd done that, we still wouldn't see anything. So first off, you can't just put a comma after a default export. So you can have one single default export, but only one. You can, however, you can do things like this. See, I'm just exporting this directly. You can export as many components as you want from a file and then import them. So if I go into here, see I'm importing app from app, but I can also import header, my header, like that. So you notice that's inside curly braces. That's the difference. This here that's not in curly braces means I want to import the default export from this file. Anything in curly braces, I want to import a named export, as it's called. It's a little confusing because I can actually change this to whatever I want. Do this, and it will still, that won't actually work. All right, well, I'm not gonna bother fixing that because it's kind of a little goofy thing.
No, I got you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I could get into the errata here. This is an easy point of confusion though, as you start having more files. If you accidentally import the default export when you don't mean to, and you name it something else, it won't tell you there will be no error message or anything telling you that you've done something wrong. And if you try to import something that's named, you actually need to use the exact name you're using in the other file. Although it also won't error out if it doesn't come in, it will just import undefined. And then if you try to use it anywhere, it will give you an error, essentially. It's a little bit confusing, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But yeah, eventually, we're not gonna really do it in this tutorial, but eventually you're gonna wanna be spacing things out in different files in one way or another, and you will be dealing with importing and exporting. So it's good to at least get familiar with it. So, so we've got these two headers. Now let's say I wanted to go, remember before I had my text inside the header, right? Let's say I want the text is a variable so I can use it as many places as I want. So let's say I want to go back, I'm gonna take out this link here. I don't need this big block of stuff here. I just wanna show that text again. I'll put it in the paragraph tag. Now, when I go into my browser, I'm gonna see an error. Luckily, React is pretty good about giving you explicit errors. It wasn't always that way, so I like that they've gotten a lot better at telling you exactly what line is messed up and exactly what it's expecting and not seeing. So this is something you got to start thinking about though now as you're splitting things up into different components, is that this text constant here, that only exists within the scope of the app component. So basically within these curly braces, text is defined. Anywhere outside of there, it's gone. So I'm not able to use that same variable here. It will just error out as it does currently. So there's a couple ways we can deal with that. One is we could move this constant outside the app entirely, put it up here. So now it is moved from the scope of that component to the scope of the file. So this entire file can now see this. And if I go back into my browser, actually, oh, interesting. Maybe okay, never mind. That actually doesn't work. well, that's not the way we want to do it anyway, because I was trying to make a point. So here's the point I'm making. Let's say we do have this text. We want to pass that text into another component. How do we do that? We have these things nested, but we want to like communicate between them. This is where props are going to start coming in. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that variable, we're going to pass it into the component as a prop. Props and state are the two big aspects of components that affect how you deal with this kind of dynamic data. And it's good to understand props as external values. They come from outside the component, they're passed into the component, then the component has them but can't change them. They're immutable. So they're only a concern, they're only changeable at that higher level. So let's go back into our code here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my header, and just the same way I'm passing class name here into the div tag, that's exactly the same kind of syntax you use in your own components. So I'm just going to say text equals text. Now, so I'm passing in a prop called text to my header. But when we open up the browser, it's still going to be undefined. Still not working, right? Because the way this works is this doesn't just become available inside this component. It actually comes in as part of an object called props. I'm going to put those right here, and I'm going to change text to props.text. And that still doesn't work.
Is it because of the export in the beginning of the function myHeader?
That shouldn't matter. Oh, you know what? All that magic I was talking about, the browser automatically reloading, it wasn't reloading. So I just hit manual reload. So even in spite of all the magic, you're sometimes still going to have to just like kick the tires a little bit and get it running again. So now you notice that before we were passing, this was just nothing, right? There was nothing going into this function, and we were able to call it. This is kind of a quirk of JavaScript. So the thing is, anytime that you show a component, anytime you're displaying a component on screen basically by putting it into your JSX, so basically if it's in these angle brackets, React is going to call the function that gives that the component is, right? Because the component is just a function. It's going to call it with this props object. In this case, if I had just done this, it would just be empty, but it's still there. And the thing about JavaScript is that you can just not pass in things to a function, or you can pass in extra parameters or do whatever you want, and JavaScript doesn't stop you. This is kind of unusual. Most languages will give you errors at compile time when you try to do that, but JavaScript just kind of tries to keep going. It's this sort of fake it till you make it language, and that's the whole philosophy of it, which can make it a little bit hard to debug. So one thing to keep in mind is that in general, there's a lot of things that could be failing that will just fail silently. And React tries to get ahead of this. That's why we get the nice big error message when we're showing something undefined on screen, because JavaScript does not care about this variable being undefined. It'll just not show anything. It was React in this case that's standing between us and making a pretty common mistake and being helpful enough to tell us where the problem is. So that's just a little aside. Basically, anytime you call a component, you're going to be passing in a props object, and that's where all of these go. So if I pass in something else, and I can name these whatever I want. This is just an object. I'm basically defining the keys of the object every time that I add something here, and those will then be available in props under that particular key. So I can call this, whatever, and then inside here, props.whatever, and there it is. So you're not constrained to what you call these things. It can be anything you want, basically. Basically, the props are sort of an agreement between whatever your component is expecting and whatever is being passed in from a higher level, essentially. You just have to keep in mind that those two things are the same. There are some tools you can use to kind of, there used to be this thing called prop types, which you can still bring in, where you can define exactly what props you're expecting in a component, it's good to start doing stuff like this just to make sure you're not you're not misspelling things or making other little mistakes. Because since you're in control of all of these different variable names, it's very easy to also, screw up here and there. And again, JavaScript will sometimes fail silently and it'll be confusing as to why things aren't coming through the right way. Any questions so far? All right. So the cool thing about props is they're not limited to just text like I'm doing now. They're not limited to just data. You can also pass in functionality. You can pass in functions, what might be called callback functions, or sometimes they're called closures. You can pass that into your component and then use that function inside the component. So let's say we want a button, right? We want a particular function to be called when the button gets pressed. So we're going to add that to the header. The header is going to have a button, but the header is not going to have its own idea of what to do when the button is clicked. The header is going to have an on-click prop that's passed in. And when we click the button, it will simply call that function without even really knowing what the function is. This is actually pretty great because if you have a lot of really complicated logic, but your UI really just needs to know, hey, the user clicked this button, then you can set it up exactly that way so that your UI never understands what's happening when the button is clicked. It simply reports that the button was clicked, and somewhere higher up on your chain, you can have a lot of complicated logic dealing with whatever the button does. And this is nice because then you don't spread all that logic around your app. You can just have your UI focus on just show the button, make it look nice, tell me when it gets clicked, and all of your logic can live somewhere else where it's easier to debug and understand the flow of it. So to give an example, let's go ahead and get rid of whatever. We don't need this. Let's add a button right underneath our text here. Click me. All right, so that will just show up here as a regular HTML button. It's clickable. As you can see, it's responding to my clicks, but nothing is happening, right? We haven't actually defined its on-click property yet. So now, let's do this. Let's pass in on-click to my header. We're gonna open up some curly braces. Now, what we have to do here is what you're sometimes gonna see, this is called an anonymous function, and sometimes you're gonna see this called the fat arrow syntax because of that big equal sign there. What we need to do is this is how we tell it that we're passing in a function essentially. So basically this function is a bit of stuff that's going to happen, a bit of logic that's going to be executed, and it lives inside these curly braces until it actually gets called, basically. So it's important to remember that, like, if I started putting some logic in here, well, I'll just show you an example because this is an easy place to make mistakes. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do open parentheses and then an equal sign in a bracket, and then we're going to call an alert. And we'll just say, hey, you click the button. Oh, okay. So now we know that we're passing a function into my header, and that's going to come in as props on click. So what I can do here is the button, which, as you can see, has its own on click prop essentially. We're just kind of passing the prop along because the button is just a built-in thing that your browser knows how to handle and knows how to deal with the click and then call its own on click function. And we can do props on click. And now we go into here. Awesome. So we've defined the function in the app component, and then we just passed it into the header. And then the header just knows to call that function. It doesn't know what it is. It has no clue what it does. All that logic lives up here at a higher level, which is generally how you want to be creating your apps as much as possible, or at least you want your logic to live in one place, because then it just gets so much easier to manage. Is this making sense to everyone so far?
Yeah, Quinn, just a question, and maybe this would be better for our instructors, I'm not sure, but we last week were working in Django building real basic apps, and we were using Bootstrap to make it look a little nicer. Mm-hmm. What's the relationship between React and Bootstrap? Do you use one or the other?
You could use both. Bootstrap is just it's just a CSS library basically that has like built-in nicer stuff. There's probably
there are sorry to interrupt, but we are going to be utilizing some JavaScript like React Bootstrap libraries later on.
Okay, cool.
So,
I just
that are
I
designed
associate adding
to
a button
combine that
with-
functionality.
with Bootstrap, and I saw you do it in React, and just wanted to know if I needed to know how to do both.
well, I didn't really do it in React. This button I made here is actually just an HTML button.
Oh,
That
okay.
is plain old HTML. Actually, React might have a button component. I know React Native does. Sometimes it has stuff like that, but yeah. And also, generally speaking, if you want to integrate React with anything else like Bootstrap or any other popular web thing, even if it's not JavaScript, there's probably a package out there that does it for you.
Okay.
And makes it a little bit smoother. So sometimes that's usually the best way to go. The only catch is that if you have a really complicated app and you're trying to maintain it over years, you have to make sure those libraries get updated. Things will break over time. But it saves you a lot of time up front. So, but that's what's great about React. That's the whole ecosystem thing I was talking about, is that somebody out there has made a package. There's probably several. So just find the most popular one and then drop it in, and you can probably save hours of time every single time you integrate something, which is very cool.
Thanks.
Yeah. So earlier I started mentioning why it's important to have this bit here, the fat arrow syntax, and I'll show you why. So let's say we forgot to do that. And I will tell you, I forget to do that a lot. So this is a very simple and easy mistake to make. But let's say I pass in this instead. I take out the open paren, I take out the arrow. I just pass in alert. Hey, you click the button. Let's go back in here. Okay, so it's a little hard to tell because this refreshed behind the scenes. So I'm gonna just manually refresh the page right now. Yeah, well, you notice this keeps popping up, right? It just pops up on its own. Why is that? So let's take a look at what happened here. So before I put the fat arrow syntax there, I pass in this anonymous function. So I'm like, here is some functionality that I want you to call when the time is right. So it doesn't get called immediately. In this case, without that, I'm simply telling JSX, hey, show an alert. So it just does it immediately. As soon as the page renders, this gets called. And then what happens is, what onClick does is it takes the output of this and passes that into my header. And in this case, the output of alert is undefined. So it passes undefined into my header. And now when I try to click, I'm gonna get nothing. If I can get this to stop popping up, nothing happens. And the reason you don't see any error messages is because it is totally cool to have an undefined as the value of your onClick for a button. It just means don't do anything. And this is an example of a sort of silent failure. You said no React errors, nothing. I simply made the wrong choice. And fortunately, I can tell something's up because it's popping up right when the page renders. So usually this is a pretty easy error to fix, but it's an annoying one and it will happen a lot. So it's just important to remember that you are passing in, you know, this function, not the result of the function, if that makes sense. So I talked a bit about props. The next big thing is state, and state is like props. You know, it's data, it's JavaScript that defines dynamic stuff that you're going to be showing in your components, but it's a set of internal values, and the component manages them itself, and they can be changed. That's the big thing. Props can't be changed. If I try to change the props, so if I try right at the top here to even just change this text, like if I say props.text equals new value, I'm going to get an error because this is a read-only property. Everything that comes into props cannot be changed. That's something that React will enforce. So if I want to change it based on something the user's doing or some new data that came through, I need to use state instead. So there's two ways to use state. The traditional way is you would turn your app function that we're currently using into a class, and then that gives you access to a property of a React component class called this. It's this.state, basically, the same way you currently would use props or this.props in this case to pull anything out that's being passed into your component. This.state will exist and can be used for state. And this is why you can't use class, why you have to use class name for CSS because of this particular use inside React. But the new hotness is hooks. Hooks are a way to do this in a more lightweight and quick way, and you don't need to change your entire function into a class. So I'm going to show you the classic approach first because it's good to know, but in this particular instance, hooks probably make a lot more sense, but I'll show you why. So what we do here is, let's say we want something to change when the button gets clicked, right? So my header is going to become a class. I don't need to turn app into a class. This can still be just a function, or what's called a stateless functional component, SFC. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as. Once something becomes a class, the components that contain it don't need to themselves become classes. It can just do it on its own. So I'm going to take away function, and I'll make this class my header. And I'm going to get rid of the props here because this is how you declare a class. So right away, you're going to see I'm getting some angry red underlines because this is not how a class works. So I need to take all this stuff that's in here, all of the JSX that we're returning from the function is now going to be part of a render method. So if I do this, now actually if I jump back into my browser, oh yeah, props doesn't exist yet. So the other thing I need to do is anywhere I'm referencing props, I can still get props anywhere inside this class, but I need to use this dot props because that's just how class syntax works in JavaScript. So if I change props to this dot props, I make sure to wrap this return block in a render method, and I go back into my browser, then I get all sorts of problems. Interesting.
You have to extend the component class.
Yep, that's right. Very good. I don't even know if is React even in scope here. Yeah, it's not. Okay, so I have to actually do one more thing. I have to actually import React here explicitly because I need it in order to grab this component. There we go. Thanks for the catch. So yes, so this is not just a pure JavaScript class. I'm extending React component. This is the same way you will extend classes in Python and any other class-based language. React.component has all of this functionality already baked in. React knows how to deal with it. It knows what to call and when in order to, do all of the functionality of your components and then display them at the right time, basically. So that's where this render method comes from, essentially. And actually, React is just basically doing this under the hood with your function right here. It's essentially a functional component is basically a component that only has a render method and nothing else. So this is the only one that's required. Every single component class that you create is going to have a render method defined because it needs to output something. Even if it outputs null, it needs to output something. And essentially, what's happening here is I drop my class, my header, into some other JSX, and it's going to, as soon as it's rendering this component, it's going to look at the class and it's going to look for the render method and it's going to call the render method, basically. All stuff that's happening invisibly to you, but that's basically what's going on. So otherwise, it's not really any different. This is actually how you used to do everything, I think, before they really started getting popular with these functional components. But this is essentially the same thing as this. The only difference is that now I have access to all these other lifecycle methods, as they're called. So I can do certain things right when the component is first created, the very first time it's rendered. If I want to do something special, I have the option of doing that here. And other stuff like that. Usually you don't need to do that, but it is an option. So what I'm going to do is create a state object here at the top. And I'm going to, let's see if that's actually the right syntax. I haven't done this in a while. Yep. And I'm going to create, dynamic text right in here. It's going to be, I can be changed. So the same way that props is just an object that contains whatever you pass into your component, state is just an object that contains whatever you say it is. And once again, you're in total control of all these keys of whatever is in here. It's entirely up to you. The only thing that the component cares about is that it's an object, and that it can be changed. So instead of using the onClick prop that we're passing in, we're going to do our own thing here. We're going to add an anonymous function into onClick right here. Oh, wait, before I do that, all right, I'm going to make that empty. Before I do that, I want to actually display the dynamic text just to make sure that this is all working. So instead of doing this.props.text, I'm going to do this.state.dynamic text. And if I open this up, cool. So now there's my state text. You access it basically the same way you would with a prop, just dump it right into your JSX and it will display. Nothing happens yet when I click this. So let's change that. So now, there's a couple ways I can, well, there's one right way I can do this and there's a wrong way. This.state.dynamic text, unlike the props, remember I got that error message when I tried to change it. If I want to say this.state.dynamic text equals button clicked, then close this. Okay, there we go. Now you'll see this did not throw up an error message. It didn't do anything either, right? Nothing changed. That's kind of funny, right? Now the thing that's going on here, you can't see it, but this value did actually change, but it didn't update. Now remember I mentioned that the diffing algorithm looks for changes in your state and then updates your UI, but it only does that at certain times when you do things the correct way. So in this case, there's actually a method I need to call in order to change this. I can't just change the value directly. What I want to do instead is call this set state. And then what I do here is set state is a function that takes, sorry? No, that was a question. Okay. This.setState is a function that is going to take an object that represents the change you want to make to the state. So you're basically passing in whatever value you want to change. I pass that in. It will only change that value and nothing else. So in this case, I want to change dynamic text. There's nothing else to change. Give it a new value. And now, let me go back here and I click this, button clicked. So what happened there is the React did not update the state because it needed to see that set state was called in order to do it. It won't just automatically change everything. There's a particular process you need to follow. The thing is though, since that value actually had changed, if other stuff changed on my screen, I might have eventually seen that text change over, but it would have happened at a weird time I wasn't expecting because the whole page would re-render. It would see that the state was different. It would change that particular value, but